I thank the member for Bass, and the question is that this bill will now be read a second time, and I call the member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, the Australian public don't play word games. They don't pass, they don't hedge, they don't engage in clever verbal moves that frequently dominate this domain. They're direct. They were with our side of politics last September. That's why we're on this side of the House. We respect their decision. We accept the umpire's call. But in any election, two spotlights are always working the field. The focus is on the two major sides of debate, and the public watched and made up their minds. They took into account the pledges, the commitments and the promises made, and their fresh memories are being used as a basis to judge this budget. The public, the same umpire that made the call with us, is speaking authoritatively about the Coalition's budget and about the Coalition's values as demonstrated by deed in government. Remember, before the election, you'd turn on the TV and you'd see the Prime Minister doing two things. He was either wearing a fluoro vest or he was making a promise. These days he doesn't wear the vest and he doesn't keep the promises. I could literally fill up my entire speech recounting the long list of broken promises, but I won't. I'm going to use the speech to talk about how the budget hurts the nation and harms the Chifley electorate. But there are two critical quotes I think are important to remind the House of. One is a quote deliberately, specifically designed to create an impression in the minds of the public about how the Prime Minister would behave in government. And the other is a promise built for full effect, purposefully repeated, delivered right as the public were about to cast their vote. The first defining quote: "It is an absolute principle of democracy that governments should not and must not say one thing before an election and do the opposite afterwards," spoken by the Prime Minister in 2011 as opposition leader. The second commitment, promise, pledge, vow, uttered in September: "I want to give people this absolute assurance: no cuts to education, no cuts to health, no changes to pensions, no changes to the GST." Now, I need not add any commentary or observation of my own. Why? Because the public has made its own mind up, based on what they saw and heard. This budget has either transformed or confirmed their view of the Prime Minister. The budget shows that the Prime Minister has gone from being chief promise maker to chief promise breaker, and see the reaction within the public domain. After all the sweat and all the effort to sell this budget, this work has delivered nothing. The verdict does not just sit in the minds of the public, it sits on the minds of their own. It's their own side that has been revealed to have said the budget is a stinking carcass, and Chifley residents are telling me so too. Some of these residents spoke sharply to me when I was in government, and they are now scathing of this government. Emailed one: "When I last night saw and confirmed this morning on the internet that the senior supplement of $60+ per fortnight, i.e. $1,560 per annum, is going to be abolished as of 1st July 2014, I decided I will never ever vote Liberal again. A government never takes anything away from aged pensioners. It will give but never take away." And let me add his earlier quote: "You will remember me from before the last federal election. Over the past 48 years, I have voted without fail for the Liberal Party, both federal and state." So, within the minds of their own side and within the minds of their own voters outside this place, the budget's failed. It's stained the Prime Minister, and it is set to smear everything this government touches or does over the term of this parliament. It is a budget that will be spoken about for many years to come, and rightly so. The public's already speaking, loud and clear. For example, and as a guide, Fairfax Media found in a survey of voters overwhelming rejection of some of its key measures. 76% disapprove of the budget's cuts to public hospitals. 62% reject paying more for prescriptions. 61% reject the increase twice yearly of the petrol excise. Substantial rejection of any move to increase the pension age to 70. And the public's sending a signal about their views of the Prime Minister. In other work conducted by Essential Media, it's shown that more than two-thirds of respondents, 67%, an increase of 11 percentage points, said the PM was, quote, out of touch with ordinary voters. Less than a third of voters agreed he was trustworthy, and 63%, up 5%, said he was arrogant. The trust of the Australian public has been smashed. Their sense of fairness has not only been abused, it's been stomped all over by an uncaring coalition government. We knew what was coming in this budget. We got a taste of it in the release of the mid-year Economic and Fiscal Outlook, MyEFO. Before the election, in August, the independently compiled pre-election fiscal outlook showed we'd have a deficit of $30 billion. By December, when the coalition brought down MyEFO, the deficit blew out an extra $17 billion. 60% of the blowout attributable to decisions the coalition took. When the coalition keeps talking about debt and deficit, I didn't realise their own guilt was speaking for them. When in opposition, the coalition told us we didn't have a revenue problem, we had an expenditure one. And in this budget, they're bringing in new taxes and tax increases. When in opposition, the coalition told us not to trust Treasury figures. Now we're told we'll get to a surplus under them based off the same group of Treasury officials that framed previous budgets using figures that were disputed by the coalition. I don't criticise Treasury here, they're professionals, dedicated and committed, but I do seek to spotlight the duplicity of the government and through this seek to show why the public's rejected their first budget. Australians for weeks, if not months before the budget, were told they'd be equally required to join in the heavy lifting to restore the budget to surplus. And now, look what's occurring. A sole parent with an income of $55,000 with 2 children, one in primary, one in high school, will face a $20,000 hit to their family budget. By just 2015, this family will face a 10% annual hit to their current family income, or more than $5,700 a year. A couple on a single income of $75,000 with 2 kids, one not yet in school, one in primary school, will face a $2,000 decline in annual family income by 2015. And by 2017-18, this family will have had $7,400 less income than they would have had prior to this budget. I mention these particular groups of families because they make up a big part of the Chifley electorate I'm proud to represent in this place. Now, as I've said numerous times since the budget announcement, the electorate of Chifley, which I represent, is hit hard and probably harder than many others in the country, and on so many levels. Now, much has been spoken about in this place and in the public about the impact of the $7 GP tax. The insult to the Australian public was soon followed by the Treasurer referring to that impost of a GP tax in a visit to a doctor as equivalent to 2 small beers. In defending the indefensible, the Treasurer said, "1 packet of cigarettes, not cigars mind you, 1 packet of cigarettes costs $22. That gives you 3 visits to the doctor. You can spend just over $3 on a middy of beer, so that's 2 middies of beer to go to the doctor." Just bizarre to be able to say that in the public space. And in the 2 weeks since the budget, I've had cases of long-serving doctors come up to me and say that the GP tax is simply an attack on the medical profession. One GP told me last week his practice simply doesn't have the resources necessary to turn it into a tax collection agency for the Abbott government. Then there's the issue of security, with cash now being kept on premises, new costs to be borne by small practices in changing their security arrangements. Well, what about the valuable time lost with staff forced to travel to the bank to deposit that cash? These small businesses, these GP practices, will line up to be the first to say and dispute the coalition's claim it's both the best friend of Medicare or small business. Practices in Mount Druitt, Woodcroft, Glendenning, Rooty Hill, Blacktown have seen drops in the number of patients presenting for help, people scared away from help because of the GP tax. These clinics SMSing patients, reminding them to see the doctor because the GP tax is not in yet. Many of the GPs in my areas, especially the ones that practice in residential areas, are close to retirement age. They stay in practice to help neighbourhoods they know will struggle to get medical help close by. Suburbs such as Wayland, Tregear, Emerton already struggle with the lack of local GP services. Any drop in patient numbers coming through the doors of GPs will bring forward decisions for retirement. They can't afford to bear those losses, and nor should they carry those losses into retirement. So the GP tax will not only make healthcare less affordable, it will make it less accessible. This week, we see reports that imposing on struggling families a $7 hit every time they visit a GP will threaten immunisation rates, and that's a very dangerous move because that sadly is a reality. And what about the billions cut from hospitals in this budget? State governments are already making terrible decisions when it comes to healthcare in Mount Druitt. For instance, in an area where heart disease is a major killer, the New South Wales Liberal government is shutting down our cardiac ward and replacing it with a methadone clinic. We have many avenues available to help those afflicted with substance abuse. We don't have enough to help us with heart disease. Now, the state government's made the decision. It's expected to manage with billions less for its health budget. Remember, in my EFO, the Abbott government callously cut the funds that were expected to be used in securing an MRI for Mount Druitt Hospital, which had been fought long and hard for. I shudder to think what comes next as a result of the budget pressure that the Abbott government's loading up on its state counterparts. Not that I need to be reminded, but I today look back over the last census conducted for the Chifley electorate in 2011 and took a look at the unemployment rates. Back then, national unemployment was running at 5.6%, local unemployment stood at 9%. It's always been the case, unemployment runs higher in our area and higher than the national average. Chifley's unemployment rate continues well above that average and youth unemployment much worse, so it's not only a heartless move but a dangerous one to target young unemployed in this budget. To say to an unemployed person under 30 in our area, bad luck if you haven't got a job, and by the way, we won't allow you access to unemployment benefits for 6 months, is simply unconscionable. Speaker, who among the unemployed can last 6 months without help while they're trying to find work? What parents these days have the resources to carry an unemployed child during that period of time, especially with the changes to family tax benefits, the GP tax, the fuel tax, straining budgets? What about those young people not lucky enough to have parents to support them? Telling a young person still residing at family homes they'll have to move elsewhere in a work for the dole program is not the answer, because it just won't work the way people think. This is a budget that threatens to pressure families beyond limit. The deregulation of university fees, the huge debt swamp loaded up on the young, these things are causing concerns in the minds of Middle Australia who worry about the future of their young and the next generation. That generation will be forced to carry debt well into their working years and handicapped in their efforts at their own start in working lives. Chifley motorists, among all other Western Sydney motorists, will also feel the pain from this budget as fuel excise indexation makes its unwanted return after being frozen for 13 years by then Prime Minister John Howard. Now, on my way to this place this week, I passed service stations where signs heralded unleaded fuel at $1.60 a litre, which is much higher than the point at which the excise was frozen. But its reintroduction will bite and bite again, not only when the motorist pays at the Bowser, but also when they buy anything that depended on transport moving them to market. The double whammy effect on households will be that costs will be sent down the line from transport companies, who will also be slugged with twice-yearly fuel indexation. These costs will flow on everything we buy, and if you try to sidestep that cost by using public transport, you'll hit again, because the Abbott government refuses to fund public transport infrastructure that could be used to move people, particularly across Western Sydney. Labor's opposed to this indexation. The anger that remains in the community more than 2 weeks after this budget is clear evidence of its unfairness. It's a budget that squarely puts low or no income earners, the elderly or vulnerably, squarely in the sights. Pensioners cruelly lined up for attention by this Abbott government. In my home state alone, $450 million in joint funding with New South Wales government's been axed across forward estimates intended for concessions for pensioners on transport, council rates, water and electricity bills. To strip pensioners of these simple but vital means of assistance is cruel, and it's little wonder state governments are howling about the burdens placed upon them. My electorate office has been swamped and they're furious. Pensioners, with the fact that the senior supplement, a vital leg up for a couple, will be wiped out from September, and there'll be the sting in the tail of deeming drawdowns on superannuation and indexation changes that will rob pensioners of future earnings. Welcome to retirement, Abbott government style. The pain of this budget, the unfairness of this budget, the way that it affects low and middle Australia, yet leaves those well off untouched, and potentially gaining under a paid parental leave scheme that is squarely unfair in its architecture and in the way it'll operate, has meant that this will leave a bitter taste in the mouths of the public, and they shouldn't be forced to bear this cost.